Okay, let's get going. Welcome everybody. This is part 5 of this year's BGA FRTOL course. Before we start, let me tell you who's going to do what and a couple of other things. So this evening I'll do the intro. Chula's going to do the presentation, and this one's about emergencies. And Andrew will be taking questions. So if you do have a question, please put it on the chat channel to Andrew. I'll sort out the breakout groups and run those. Coaches, as always, please make sure you've got a star in front of your name. While I'm talking about it, let me just see if I can mute everybody. Yeah, that's probably a way of doing that, isn't it? I'll sort that out in a moment. Oh, there we go, mute all. Right, so I'm going to mute everybody. Chula, when you start, you'll have to unmute. A point came up from last week, which I thought I'd just spend a minute on, and it's about the use of scripts. We put the scripts together actually mostly for the coaches, not for the students. The idea being that particularly those coaches who were less experienced than, say, the air traffickers we have on the call, had something to work from. But we thought they were useful to everybody in terms of giving a framework for to work with. But what we don't want you to do is follow the scripts religiously. This isn't a question of learning every word that's on the script. What we want you to do is make sure that you understand the framework of what you're doing, so what the structure of the message is, and then figure out how to put the information that you've got into that structure. And if the coaches, when they're working with you, vary what it is that you're getting, just like in real life, that's great. So don't complain to the coaches that they haven't followed the script exactly, because that's not how the world works. What you could do that might be useful, though, is have a piece of paper in front of you and write some of the key information down that would be available to you in the glider. You could write your altitude down. You could write, because you can read that off the altimeter. You could write the QNH down, because you can read that off the altimeter. You could write down maybe your position, what your next turning point is. That's on your map. So you don't have to hold everything in your head, but if you can have those key pieces of information and then fit those into the framework of the messages that you do have in your head, I think you might find it easier. So work like that. All right, and before we start, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do next week. Next week is the last of the formal sessions that we do. So we're going to be talking, for those who want to do it, we're going to be talking about the test. I'm not going to prejudge what we're going to say, partly because we haven't written it yet, as these things change rapidly. But we'll cover what your options are going to be on the test, again, for those who want to do it, and how you go about it. We'll do a little catch up of a few bits and pieces we need to make sure you need to know so that we can sign you off as ready for the test. But most of the session, as all of these have been, will be about practice. So you'll be practicing complete routes with your coaches. We'll also take you through what the next steps are for those who want to do the exam. And just briefly, what we normally do is there are a number of the coaches, hopefully most of them, will sign up to provide a few weeks of coaching on a time scale to theirs and your convenience. And we'll put small groups together of a number of students with a particular coach, probably regionally based if we can. So if you've got a coach at your club, we'll try and make that match. Then you can meet in person if you want to, or you can do it virtually like we're doing now. So that's it. That's the preview for next week. Chula, Andrew, have I missed anything that you want to say before we get into Chula stuff?
No, thank you.
Okay, Andrew, good. I'll take that as a yes. In which case, Chula, over to you.
Thank you very much. And good evening, everyone. So as Paul's already said, part 5 of 6, emergencies and VHF direction finding. The slides, as usual, will be available on Paul's website. If you've got ahead of things and printed them off already, if that's what you do, just to say that there's a slightly modified slide deck going up in the next half an hour. When I get to the 2 slides which aren't in the deck, I'll mention it to you. Covering emergencies, the distress and diversion cell, Sonic, talk about how you can practice calls with D&D, direction, distress and diversion, and we'll talk about VDF as said, and as usual followed by coaching. Just before coaching, Dave Fiddler's kindly going to come on the channel, so to speak, and give us some real life experience and anecdotes, and I think a couple of tapes just to bring it to life. Okay, so distress calls, prefixed with the word Mayday said 3 times. You can find the definition in CAT 413. This is my emphasis. If you or somebody else needs assistance, and I put it in red to say blood's on the horizon, if these words seem relevant, there's real threat, it's serious, there's danger, and it's about to happen, then that's probably a Mayday. The next level of priority down is an urgency call, and that is prefixed with pan pan said 3 times. Not the word pan said 3 times. So it's pan pan, pan pan, pan pan. And this talks about the safety of an aircraft or a vehicle, and it doesn't require immediate assistance, but it's maybe something important. So the top picture there, you know, if your wing was about to fall off, then clearly that's a Mayday. If you see somebody whose wing's fallen off, there's been a mid-air collision, that's a Mayday. If you're lost, and let's put this in the power world because that's, well, it could be power or gliding. If you're lost, then that's arguably a pan call. If you were feeling unwell and you really couldn't concentrate and you just needed to land, then that would be perhaps an urgency call, a pan call. It's great in the bar or on a rainy day to wonder what is a Mayday and what is a pan call, and trying to sort out the differentiation between those two. In real life, of course, that's of secondary importance. Even in the test, unless you were blatantly ballpark, it's not going to be critical. So don't get wrapped around the axle wondering if it's a Mayday or a pan call. CAT 413 format or something shorter. Okay, this is one of those times where we have to say the test requires you to know the standard ICAO format, and it's listed there, and that's how you should deliver your emergency call, for instance, your Mayday call, according strictly to that format. In real life, you're not going to do that. You're going to convey the fundamentals, and I'm going to suggest to you that's your call sign and type of aircraft, what's wrong and what you intend to do about it, and where you are in 3 dimensions. And if you wanted to add one more thing that's probably quite important, certainly in the case of a Mayday, if you're going to end up in a crash somewhere, then the person's on board. So for the test, stick to the format. For real life, think what is going to be important to convey. And actually, it's probably, this is the moment to say, in real life, no one's going to come and help fly that aeroplane. So fly the aeroplane first, then when you have some capacity left, get your call out. I want to say to respect the message priority rule, and this is one of these, this list, by the way, which is again in CAT 413, of course, is something that sometimes gets tested. So you should understand that distress takes priority over everything else. And that's a reminder to say that when you get onto the emergency frequency, the first thing you should do, unless you are a Mayday, is listen and make sure that the frequency isn't in use by someone who has a more urgent or a higher priority call than you do. If you do hear an emergency call on the everyday frequency that you're on, then your duty is first of all to stay quiet, to stay silent. If you've got the capacity to fly as well as note the details, then note the details. If the emergency call is not answered, imagine their radio is weak or they're too low, you can hear them, but it doesn't seem that they've been heard by a ground station, then that's your job to relay that message onto the controller that you are talking to. If you're talking to, I will say, Dunstable Base, a gliding club, then that's probably not a very useful thing to do. The thing to do would be to get onto distress and diversion on 121.5. So let me just repeat that. Stay quiet if you hear an emergency call. Note the details, either in paper or in your head. If it's not answered, then relay to an appropriate authority, probably the frequency that you're on. Stay on scene if you can help and if it's safe for you to do so. We're going to hear from Dave, compelling stories in a few minutes. I'll just quickly say, I once heard a glider pilot making a Mayday call. It's actually, no pun intended, pretty distressing. And it really grabs a lot of your attention. So it is the correct advice to give you that you should stay on scene and help, for instance, to direct emergency services to the location, but only if it's safe for you to do so, because it is, unless you really are of the right stuff, it really is quite a powerful psychological moment. So I mentioned the distress and diversion cell a couple of times. So this is an RAF staffed big room in Swanwick. The frequency is 121.5, and they can provide assistance for you, advice, maps, help you find where you are. They can coordinate with other ground stations, that's for instance other airfields or other ground services. And very, very usefully, they have a facility called auto triangulation. So if you speak on that frequency, 3 if you're high enough, which in southern England is probably something like 2,000 feet. I think it's higher in the remoter parts of the country. If you're high enough, 3 lines will come together from there. I think they've got, I think it might be 300 aerials around the country. So if you speak on 121.5, and so long as you're not down in the weeds, 3 lines will come together and you will be at the intersection point of those 3 lines. So that can be very helpful if you're lost or not sure where you are, or if you're indeed about to land or crash somewhere. If, however, you don't crash and you're a glider and you land in a field and you don't want the air ambulance turning up and everybody else with their blue lights, then what some of us do is call D&D and tell them that you are a glider, where you've landed, call sign, colour they might ask you for, white of course, generally. And so you might choose to do that to save the emergency services wasting their time. So that's their phone number. They very much welcome practice. That's practice for them and practice for you. So there's a couple of things that you could do. And of course, the first thing to do is to turn to the frequency, make sure the volume's up, listen, and make sure they're not doing something first. And you could practice an urgency call. So notice what you cannot do. I say again, you cannot do. You can't practice a Mayday call. You can't practice a distress, but you can practice an urgency call. So you could make the initial call, their call sign, your request, request practice pan. Their call sign is London Centre. Their call sign is London Centre. And then they'll say, go ahead, normally they'll say, go ahead with your practice pan, and you could deliver a practice pan. Perhaps saying you're unsure of where you are, or perhaps why don't you use my example, say you're not well, you require a vector to the nearest airfield, and they will give you a bearing and range to the nearest airfield. Don't spend too long on the frequency, because somebody else might want to use it for real, but also it's worth knowing that lots of commercial operations, they have their second radio tuned to 121.5, and they don't really want to be hearing call after call after call. So yes, by all means practice, it's good to practice, keep it short, succinct, and then move on. The other thing you can do is to ask for a training fix, and that is to exercise this auto triangulation that I was talking about. I'm going to say this note a couple of times. If you are lost, you should say you're lost. But let's just stick with training fix for a second. So you could say this: training fix, training fix, training fix. Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta request training fix. They will come back, and by the way, in my experience, there's always a significant pause. So give them a good 10 seconds or so before you repeat anything. They will say something like this: Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, London Centre, your position indicates 5 miles southwest of Milton Keynes. Do you require further assistance? And you can say, no, thank you, or you can ask for something else if you want to. But probably if it's a training fix, then your response is negative, changing to, and say where you're changing to. Once again, if you're lost, then the right thing to do is to say you're lost and ask for some navigational assistance. A linked idea here is that there are some emergency transponder codes which you need to know. So 7700 is the emergency code, and a way to remember that is 77 going to heaven. Remember, this is bad news if it's a mayday. So 77 going to heaven, emergency. Lost comms, radio failure, 76. 76 need a fix. Think of a radio beacons trying to fix you, like that auto triangulation. 76 need a fix for radio failure. Unlawful interference or hijack. 75 stay alive. You'll stay alive if you do what I tell you. 75 stay alive. Hijack. So those are the 3 codes to remember. Back to if you're lost, then say you're lost, get help, because you don't want to look out the window and find that the typhoon these days is sitting next to you, because that is what could happen if you get badly lost and go into the wrong places. Dave Fiddler's very kindly going to share some of his service experience and real life anecdotes, and I think a couple of tapes. Dave?
Okay, Julia, can you hear me?
Straight 5.
Evening all. For my sins, I've had 5 Maydays in my life and quite a number of pans. It's because I flew a rocket pursuit ship around the world. 3 fires, 1 explosive decompression at 44,000 feet over an airway. I'll talk more about that a bit later on. And 1 operational diversion in the Mediterranean, coming back from the Middle East, when ATC were not playing ball. That brings me to a point. Julia has gone nicely through what they all mean and the precedents go through it. The one that I would like you to take away is, if you call Mayday, air traffic have to give you top priority. And that means if you're within landing distance on an airfield, they shove other people away because you are in dire risk. If you call PAN, they will give you priority, but you are not top priority. In other words, if you call PAN at about 10, 15 miles away, they will gaily let people land while you are getting closer. Only as you approach the circuit will they start shutting things down. A subtle difference, but one that I have used in times to affect. Now, my training lasted about 3 years to become a fast jet pilot. And in that time, I practiced one hell of a lot of emergencies because that's what they make you do, to put you under pressure. But my first experience couldn't really prepare you for that. I was in my single pursuit ship. I was live gun firing at about 10,000 feet. I was tipping in, and because we were deployed down to St. Morgan, we were rotating the aircraft rapidly, and the clangers went. Now, the clangers are the emergency things, and in our cockpit, on our left-hand side, we had a Christ Almighty panel, and on the right-hand side, we had a Core Blimey panel. And normally, it would be the Core Blimey panel that had fired off after 10 minutes after takeoff, because the oxygen hadn't vaporized properly, liquid oxygen we carried. The pressure had dropped, and it was telling you, you're about to die because you're not getting oxygen. So I tipped in with a fully armed aircraft to start shooting. And I thought, young lad, well, I better look at it, see what it is. I looked at it, double reheat fire. And I'll tell you, that shocks the hell out of you the first time you get it. Oh, shit. And I put out a Mayday call, but not very professional. I then started flying back towards St. Morgan, and I was plagued, and I mean plagued, by a bloody range safety officer who would not let me get off the frequency until I'd called guns safe. That was the least of my problems at the time. And some people can make life a little bit heavy, but I assure you today, air traffic controllers are really, really good at assisting you, and you should use them. The tips that I would give you, as always, think before speaking. A garbled Mayday that is then lost with other things doesn't come across very effectively and won't get you that instantaneous help. So think about it, but there are occasions, and I have heard them, where you just get Mayday, 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 Victor Tango ejecting or jumping, because it's better to get something out than nothing. And of course today, and we had it as well, you can just squawk 77. So if you're tied up doing a lot of work at the time and you have a squawk, then as soon as you put on 77 in there, it really sends the bells and whistles working out in the world. It puts 4 stripes against your aircraft, and it sounds emergency bells in the air traffic units, so they know someone is in problems. As I said to you, adrenaline will take over, and as Chula says, it is distressing. I've seen a couple of guys pile in, and other people then lose it at the time because they can't handle watching a guy die and fly an airplane. So it will affect you at that stage. But if you can try and control it, and that's the first thing I would say to you, get the call out, control your emotions, and then settle down and try and do your best by the aircraft. But use that air traffic, because they will help you and will make life easy for you. And as you've learned through the course, if you get overloaded by them, use the standby. We had a very emphatic in our day, wait out, which means shut up until I speak to you. But today you have to use standby. But I'm sure if you were to say wait out to them, they would play ball. Lastly, cancelling emergencies. I've had quite a number in my time, but I have never done it, because you shouldn't really use the emergency call unless you are an emergency. And if you have something that goes wrong and you then say, oh, I've sorted it, I'll carry on, you will start to degrade the system for what it's in use for. I've heard plenty of people downgrade. They've called Mayday because they thought it was calamitous. And then they've said, no, I've put the fire out, I've dealt with it. And then they've downgraded to PAN, which means that air traffic can concentrate and talk to other people. Now, the one I've used the Mayday on Italian air traffic because they absolutely refused to give me assistance when I was short of fuel, and we were actually having an argument. It can happen. I wanted to do an ILS approach because that's all the taps that I had. The controller wanted me to do a TACAN approach. I kept telling him I couldn't do it. He then turned the ILS approach off. And I said to him, "You've turned the ILS off, haven't you?" And he said, "Yes, you'll make a TACAN approach." I upped his ball game with Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And that rather shocked him. He did come and meet me on the ground. You've got to be prepared for that. And we had a little discussion, and he was a little irate, but it got the point across to him. The other one I talk about is if you get a calamitous situation close to airways, controlled airspace, do remember that the case I was in, we'd had a cockpit fire, smoking generator, a compressor unit was smoking very heavily. It actually fogged the cockpit out. I was flying with a student in a Hawk, and he went into auto mode. By auto mode, I mean he's practiced a hell of a lot of emergencies in the simulator. He's had them drilled into him. A compressor unit failure, smoke in the cockpit, right, toggle down, 100% oxygen, and I'm now springing him, no, stop. He grabs the decompression lever and pulls it. Boof, we are now in a major emergency at 44,000 feet. Bends is not nice, I assure you, and we've got to get down. You can't go into controlled airspace. You can go in if you give a Mayday call and tell them where you are and what your problems are, and all of a sudden, we were cleared through the airway. So there's a couple of vignettes from me. What I'm going to do, play you now some proper calls. The first one is by an American pilot who gets his message out, but not too well. I'll let you listen.
Dave, I heard the Maydays and nothing else.
Say it again.
Dave, I heard the Maydays at the beginning and nothing else.
All right. I'll try the other one then. Basically, that was a Mayday from an American pilot who had a engine failure. And he kept breaking his call. He kept shouting, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," and then Mayday, 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 and then Mayday, Mayday. I need your help. I've got an engine failure. So a problem. Last time I did this, I actually played it from the computer. I'm afraid I haven't done that this time. Tell me if you can hear this one then. Static.
Nothing heard at my end, but a static at the beginning.
I won't play it, but that's from a Thompson guide. They were taking off. They took a seagull down the engine. What I was playing you there was the pulsing engine working away. And the engine actually was blowing up on him at the time. He waited till he had the emergency dealt with. He'd just taken off from Manchester. He then put out a very, very professional Mayday saying that they'd lost an engine. They were turning onto the beacon, turning left 330, climbing 3,000 feet. And the controller came back to him and started giving him help. And throughout the whole 3 minutes of the Mayday, all he got from air traffic was, you can go into Liverpool, that's open. You can go into this runway. You can go into that runway. Everything was opened up for him. And a professional air traffic controller will do it. I'll hand it back to you, Chula.
Dave, thank you ever so much. Thank you very much indeed for I think you said 5 Maydays. So great experience. And can I just echo the recurring, but one of the recurring points, which is think before you speak. If you've got time, say something useful and clear. You mentioned about the don't cancel too lightly, because if it was a Mayday, then it probably was a Mayday. Can I just say for everyone who's going to take a test that then it may well be in the test that you do need to cancel the Mayday so you can continue with the rest of the test. But your real world point is heard well. Thanks ever so much, Dave. Let me just bring up my slides again. Dave, could you, as I can still see you, can you give me a nod that my slides are showing? They're not.
They're showing now, Chula.
Thank you so much. Okay, so moving on to VHF direction finding. So if you speak on the radio, this is now not about D&D. Okay, this is a more general service, VHF direction finding. So if you speak on the radio at certain stations, the controller is given a readout of where you are in relation to their station. So here's the call: Cranfield approach, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta requests QDM. And in the control facility, there will be a box something like this, and you can see here that the magnetic bearing to fly in nil wind to the station is 120 degrees. So the call back to you will be something like this: Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, QDM 120 degrees, class Bravo. Class Bravo from memory is plus or minus 5 degrees. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong. Class Bravo is the class you're going to get. That is a read back item. So you, the pilot, do need to read that back. There are 3 types. This is, by the way, one of the slides that isn't on the pack that you first saw if you downloaded beforehand, before this evening. In fact, I don't really believe in reading slides, because there it is, you can read it yourself. When Andrew's doing the questions at the end, I'm going to put 2 links in the chat. One of them is to a visual representation of this, which will make it perhaps easier to understand for those who would like a picture. I certainly found it useful. And the other link that I will put in there is a link to distress and diversion. But you do need to know these 3 Q codes. VHF direction finding, let's just, this is obviously a half-mil map. This is Cranfield, EGTC. Do you see at the bottom here, it says VDF. So that means that this station has this facility to give you VHF direction finding. And so if it says VDF, then they have that facility available to them. Lots of military airfields have it as well. It can be a check for you in terms of orientating yourself, if you want to just check where you are. If you are using it for real, because you are, if you're honest with yourself, slightly confused, my advice is, if they give you a QDM, and I'll stick with the example above of 120, I strongly suggest you turn on to 120, and then you know you're flying to a station that you were talking to. Even if you don't want to go there, I suggest that's what you do. You can use it so you can use it to orientate yourself, a check of your position along a route line, especially if you've got a QDR. So let's say you were going from Cranfield to Birmingham and you took a QDR from Bryce. I'm going to imagine they've got one. A QDR is, remember, the reciprocal of the QDM. And I actually had, in a glider, I had ATC ask me to transmit for DF. It's worth remembering that phrase, transmit for DF. That means transmit for direction finding. And what I realized they were doing was that they were assessing where I was in relation to their center line so that they could allow somebody else to safely allow somebody to take off. I would never imagine they would do that, but I actually had that happen to me. So that's VDF. So that's it from this evening. So we're about to questions. This is the group work for coaches, which we'll be coming to very shortly. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you very much, Dave, for your input as well.
Thank you, Tudor. Andrew, do we have any questions?
Yeah, just a couple. We'll start with one that came from John Shea, who asked a question that was not actually about this week, but it is worth covering briefly. So he asks, first of all, how do you know when to ask for basic service versus traffic service? In the practice scripts, it seems a bit random whether one or the other is used. So John, if you don't have a transponder, the only kind of service you're in practical terms ever going to get is a basic service. If you ask for a traffic service and you don't have a transponder, the controller is going to find it very hard to locate your radar trace precisely to know exactly where you are. So he's not really going to be able to warn you about other traffic. If you want a longer answer, I recommend Googling for CAP 1434. I say again, CAP 1434, which is a short document, only 5 pages long, and it talks about flight information services in UK airspace, outside controlled airspace. In terms of doing the test, they'll give you an aircraft with a transponder. Hey, you might as well ask for a traffic service. In real life, unless you're one of the small percentage of gliders that is carrying a transponder, don't bother asking for a traffic service. You won't get one. Just ask for a basic service. Second part of your question, how do you decide whether to use changing en route or changing to, say, port MOC 129.980? John, if you knew the amount of time we spent talking about this, CAP 413 is written from the point of view of pilots who are always talking to one controller or service provider or another. So they're always changing from one service to the next. So they will always use, say, changing to or request change to. In gliding, we very often, as you discussed, changing to a service or changing to a station that's not manned by a controller or FISO, or is just the gliding channel, or we might even just turn the radio off, which is what I do when I'm between airfields that I want to talk to. Under those circumstances, we recommend you simply use the phrase leaving the frequency. That's in real life. Just say leaving the frequency. In the test, you would always find yourself using changing to or request change to. If you need any more clarity on that, drop me some email. Okay, Jeff Moy asked, working down. Chris Bessett asks, what is PAN short for? Well, neither Mayday nor PAN is really short for anything, but there is a folk myth, maybe it's true, that Mayday is from the French, Mayday, meaning help me, and that PAN may be somehow derived from the French on PAN, meaning broken. So you call Mayday when it's, life's in danger, or PAN when something less urgent, perhaps involving some bit of kit being broken, is involved. But that may just be an urban myth. Neither of them is actually an abbreviation for anything. Nigel Murray, in the video, you should call a Mayday as a relay, but suppose you see a collision with bits of wings ripped off, etc. Nigel, if life is in danger, or you believe life is in danger, call Mayday. In practice, and if there's an immediate need for assistance, and I think if bits are falling off an aeroplane, that qualifies. In practice, I really find it hard to imagine when you would call a PAN, except perhaps, as Chula has mentioned, if you're feeling unwell, but you can still fly the aeroplane. If you're in doubt in real life, I strongly suggest calling a Mayday. The one time I called a PAN, with hindsight, it should have been a Mayday. When making a Mayday or PAN call, asks Paul, or Mayday or PAN or relay, do you wait for a response from ATSU or D&D, or you just go straight into the message? Paul, you just go straight into the message. And look at CAP 413, as I'm sure you have, to see the items you should transmit and the order you should transmit them in. You just go straight in. John asks, does 1215 work all over the UK? The answer is yes. Even if you're in Scotland, the answer is yes. Years ago, Scottish had a separate distress and diversion cell, but if you see references to it, that is now outdated. For about the last 10 years, the whole of the UK has been covered by London Centre. And That's, oh, hang on. Jack Deeth, note Cap 413 direction finding examples has the aircraft put call sign at the start and end of the message. Yes, Jack, and I believe that's just to make the message a bit longer, to give the controller a bit longer to read the bearing off the display. As opposed to reciting Mary Had a Little Lamb to make the message longer, you just put your call sign on the end. When requesting transmit for DF, what should you say? Asks Paul. Just say transmit for DF, I would suggest. If asked to transmit for QDF, what do I say and for how long? We just covered that. David, can you recommend a concise Mayday call to make just before bailing out of a damaged glider? David, in the test, you're going to give the full emergency call as detailed in Cap 413. But it's noticeable that in Cap 413, you have Mayday, name the station address, call sign type, nature of emergency. If you are transmitting on 1215, D&D will get a fix on you. They will know where you are. So if you only get out one bit of information, the most important bit of information to get out is what's wrong. To make it a call longer and easier to catch with VDF equipment. Oh, sorry, that was a continuation of the previous question. Chris says, from an airprox board perspective, we say, if you can get a traffic service, you should. Chris, fair enough, but I make the point that if you don't have a transponder, I doubt you're going to get one. David Morgan, should you put your call sign at the end of a QDM or QDR call? I thought this used to be a requirement to give you more time for the controller or equipment to catch your position. David, without looking at Cap 413, I don't know what they recommend today, but I think, yes, you're right. I thought that was the recommendation. Hans, how do you ask an aircraft to relay an emergency? E.g., you have crash landed and have no contact with any other ATSU. Hans, there is no terminology for that. You transmit your Mayday and you wait for somebody else on the channel to realize that it's not being answered and that they should relay it. And Dave Masson, is something like needing to land quickly because of a thunderstorm a PAN? Dave, I would suggest not. If there's immediate danger to life, it's Mayday. If it's an urgent situation, but there is not immediate danger to life, it's a PAN. I think making a field landing because it's a thunderstorm is just get on the phone when you get on the ground, in my view. And I think that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Right, so I think we're all set to go to breakout groups. I'm going to open the room, so off you go, and I'll sort out whoever's left when we've gone. Remember, please make a note of the room that you're assigned to, because if you, for some reason, pop back up, I can send you back to that, but I have no idea where you were meant to be. Okay, good luck, have fun.